All right, well, good evening and welcome to this Advocacy in Motion program on understanding clinical research. So thank you for being here today. It's wonderful to have the opportunity to engage with the Graves' disease patient community, working with the GDATF and Graves' disease patients. We are constantly listening, learning, and incorporating all of your insights into our work. And so I extend a thank you to all of you for sharing your experiences, your stories, and allowing us to work with you to bring important educational events like this AIM program to you today. So a little bit about Immunovant, if you're not familiar with us, we're a clinical stage immunology company dedicated to enabling normal lives for people with autoimmune disease. We're developing targeted therapies that are designed to address the complex and variable needs of patients and people with autoimmune diseases. So Advocacy in Motion is a skill building program designed for US-based patient advocates and professional organizations. We are going to be doing a number of different programs, and we really rely on you to help inform the types of programs that we develop. So at the end of the program, you'll be reminded once again, but when you do get the survey, if you take 5 minutes to fill it out, you'll get to lend your voice to the types of content that you'd like to learn more about, and we would appreciate that very much. So today, I would like to thank the Graves' Disease Thyroid Foundation and CISCRP for working together to bring this webinar to the community. The GDATF works tremendously hard to advance support and education for patients living with Graves' disease and other related thyroid disorders. And we're very pleased to be working with CISCRP. This CISCRP is the leading nonprofit organization that strives to educate and inform patients, professionals, and the public about clinical research. CISCRP, which stands for the Center for Information Study on Clinical Research Participation, is really the leading nonprofit, and they really have a very trusted role in the community for educating about and advocating for clinical research education. So we're very grateful to be working with these two organizations today to bring you this program. So let me share the learning objectives. We have 3 learning objectives for today's program. One is to review the various types of clinical research. The second is to understand the benefits and risks of clinical trial participation. And the third is to learn how to better navigate the clinical trial process. So at the end of the program, we will be saving time for a Q&A. So I encourage you to use the Q&A function on your Zoom menu to enter any questions you may have. So those questions can be addressed at the end of the program. So let's go ahead and get started. I'd like to go ahead and introduce Bridget Chapital. She is our presenter today. And Kimberly Dorris, the Executive Director of GDATF, will be moderating. A little bit about Bridget. She is actually representing CISCRP. She is a member of their advisory board and a clinical research professional with over 2 decades of experience in the biomedical research industry. She's also the founder of Hypothesis Haven Science Club, and this is a wonderful initiative that provides medical science programming for children and provides early exposure to life science careers. And Kimberly Dorris, of course, is the executive director of the GDATF, and she is a wonderful and knowledgeable advocate for Graves' disease and thyroid-related disorders, and very committed to providing support and education to patients in this space. So we're very glad to have both of you here today, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Kimberly, so you can get us started.
All right. Thank you, JB. I'm excited to be having this conversation with you today, Bridget. We'll start off with some general questions that I think will be of interest to our patient community, which is primarily we deal with Graves' disease, thyroid eye disease, and Hashimoto's thyroiditis. This is a really timely discussion because we're at a unique point in history where all of a sudden there are several different options out there for clinical trials, particularly for thyroid eye disease. And that was not the case when I got my Graves' diagnosis in 2007 or my thyroid eye disease diagnosis a year later in 2008. So I'm hoping that today Bridget can help us all get up to speed. Are you ready to get started?
Yeah, I'm glad to be here and I'm ready.
All right, thank you. Great. Let's start with the basics. Can you explain to us what clinical research is? I know there's many different types, and I think it's important for people who are thinking about participating in a clinical trial to understand the difference.
Yeah, so in simplest form, clinical research is the study of health and illness in people. So if you've ever taken a medicine or gotten a vaccine, then you have benefited from clinical trials. So trials often try to answer specific questions, some of which are trying to explore the cause of a disease. Others can look at how a person's behavior could impact their health. And then some look at new treatments to see if they have any effectiveness or if they could work better than a treatment that's already existing. And also if their new treatments are safe for people to use. So these are the clinical trials that I think most people are familiar with that actually test what are called investigational treatments that haven't yet been approved by the FDA. So there are two main categories of research, and those are observational and interventional. And the main difference, of course, is that observational studies, the researchers observe. They don't experiment or test on people. But in interventional studies, researchers are actually looking at new ways to prevent or treat a disease. So in an observational study, it's very common for investigators to assess health outcomes in groups of people according to a research plan or a protocol. So participants may receive interventions, and so that could be a medicine, it could be a drug or a device, or procedures as part of their regular routine medical care, but they're not assigned to a specific intervention by the investigator as they normally would in an interventional trial. So for example, an investigator may be observing a group of older adults to learn about the effects of different lifestyles on cardiac health. But so differently, an interventional study is the type of study in which participants are actually assigned to different groups that receive one or more interventions or treatments, or they could receive no intervention. So in this way, researchers are actually able to evaluate the effects of the interventions on biomedical and health-related outcomes. And so which group a person's going to be assigned to is determined ahead of time by the study's protocol, which is the research plan that's followed. And participants may receive diagnostic, therapeutic, or other types of interventions. And so within the observational and interventional categories of research, there are also various different types of studies housed within those. So treatment trials are just what they sound like. They test new treatments, new combinations of treatments, or new approaches to procedures. Prevention trials look for better ways to prevent disease in people who have never had the disease or ways to prevent a disease from returning. Diagnostic trials find better tests or procedures to actually detect or diagnose a particular, they find better tests to actually diagnose a particular disease or condition, pardon me. And screening trials test the best way to actually detect certain diseases or health conditions. Quality of life trials explore ways to improve comfort and quality of life for individuals who are living with a chronic illness.
All right, thank you. So many of us are probably most familiar with the treatment trials that you just spoke about, the clinical trials that are testing new treatments or new approaches to treatment. But there are so many individual steps within those trials, though. Could you talk to us about how that overall process works?
Yeah, sure. I also wanted to point out that depending on what's known and what isn't, researchers may even study the same research question using some of those different types of trials in addition to treatment trials. So that's also something to kind of keep in mind. So in terms of context, I just want to touch on the journey of developing a new therapy and the importance of clinical trials. So clinical trials are a critical part of scientific advancement and introducing new therapies for people who are impacted by disease. They're carefully designed, they are reviewed, and they are completed, and they need to be approved by health regulatory agencies such as the FDA before they can even start. And so clinical trials are actually broken up into parts or phases that take place kind of one after the other. So the first phase 1 tests investigational medication on a small group of individuals, usually healthy people, so about 20 to 80 people. And the point of that phase 1 study is just to judge its safety and side effects and find the correct dose of the medication. So in some cases, people with a specific disease can be a part of phase 1, but usually it's healthy volunteers. So for phase 2, that involves more people. So we're talking about maybe 100 to 300 people. Phase 2 studies continue to study safety, including short-term side effects, but they also start to look at preliminary data on whether this investigational medication actually even works at all on the people who actually have the disease or condition. So phase 3 research involves even more people than phase 2, and the number of participants can range anywhere from the hundreds to the thousands. And it depends on the type of disease and how common it may or may not be. So in rare diseases, you may not have that many people that actually have that disease, but there are more people. So we're trying to look and see, before it's made available to the public. We just want to know more about, is it safe? How well is it going to work? And so if a phase 3 study is successful, health regulatory agencies like the FDA usually review that safety data and how well it works, which is called efficacy data. And then once it's approved and made available to the public, researchers want to continue to track how therapy works in the real world and long-term side effects. And that's what's known as a phase 4 study. And I find that really reassuring because, we're not just looking at it in terms of like the controlled environment of a research study, but actually, we all know that once something is given in the real world, you're actually really getting to see kind of, how it interacts with other medications that people may be taking, how lifestyle choices can impact how well the drug works. And so that's really kind of what that phase 4 is really all about. And so the process that I just outlined is the traditional drug development process, but it is important to note that the steps may differ slightly depending on the medication or the disease condition, or in certain indications like cancer as well, and genetic treatments. So volunteers are very, very critical in the clinical research process. And I can't tell you how important your participation as a research volunteer is. It's important to note that not every treatment that is studied ends up working the way that research is intended. But without people like you volunteering for research, we would never have any new or better treatments available.
All right. Thank you, Bridget. That's a really great overview of the whole process. So you mentioned how important volunteers are, but it's a big commitment to join a trial, especially with so many unknowns. Can you tell us a little bit more about why someone might want to consider participating in clinical research?
Sure. Deciding to participate in research is, of course, a very personal decision and one that people should take, a lot of time to really consider. But there are many reasons that participate, and some of the more common ones are on the screen before you. So there's the opportunity to contribute to the advancement of treatment and care. Some studies are designed for or include people who are healthy, but want to help find ways to prevent a disease, such as one that might be common in their family. Other people will participate in trials just because they want to, like we said before, contribute to the advancement of medical knowledge. Specialized medical care is also another reason why certain people may opt to take part in a clinical trial. When you're on a clinical trial, it's kind of like visiting your doctor for regular care, but you will receive more attention from specialists. The office visits are typically more comprehensive, and they're also more frequent than you would normally go. And there are also many benefits of being with the specialist team more frequently that you would. And then another reason that people participate in clinical trials is just gaining access to new potential treatments. Some people participate because they've exhausted all of the standard or approved treatment options for a disease and they haven't worked, or maybe they're unable to tolerate the side effects of available medications. So clinical trials can kind of fill that gap to provide another option when standard therapies have failed or haven't provided the sort of relief that a person is looking for. And so it is also very important, of course, to acknowledge that there are risks that may come with being a part of a clinical trial. First and foremost is, this is research. So the investigational treatment may not actually work. And if it does work, you may not be assigned to receive that treatment as part of the study. So instead, you may get something called a placebo that has no active medication in it. So you can also experience side effects in a trial. And some of those could be serious. Participating in a research trial, it can be time consuming, and that can impact your personal or professional life. And sometimes if you're participating in one clinical trial, it keeps you from being able to participate in future trials for your condition. So these are just some of the risks, but there may certainly be others. And all of them are very important conversations that you should have, with family members, trusted confidants, and also importantly with your healthcare team. So in terms of diverse representation in clinical trials, it's a very essential thing. And the reason is that the clinical trial can only tell a researcher how something works in the participants of that actual trial. Right? So treatments behave differently from one population to another. And so if a trial does not include diverse participants, then we won't have a way of knowing how or if those treatments work for everyone who needs them. So unfortunately, clinical trials often don't include the group of participants that is as diverse as the full population of patients who actually might use that new treatment or vaccine, or who actually are represented with that particular condition. So for example, people who are white are often represented more than people from other racial and ethnic backgrounds in clinical research, including people who are Asian, Black, African American, Hispanic, Latino, or Native American. And in this country, race and ethnicity is a proxy or a stand-in for many other non-health related factors that actually can have an impact on health, right? So diverse trials, trials that have a lot of diversity in them, can actually help doctors to learn which treatments are appropriate for patients from different communities. And this can help pave the way for better treatments to be developed for people from those communities. But even beyond race and ethnicity, there are factors like age, factors like gender, and even whether a person lives in a city versus a rural area that can impact healthcare options that are available to those people. And so it's very important to be intentional about designing clinical trials that are inclusive of all of these groups.
All right, thank you. So now we have a better sense of how the process works, the potential risks and benefits, but I wondered if you could talk more about the protections that are in place for people who do decide to join a clinical trial.
Definitely, this is so important. Due to things that have happened historically, both international and within the United States, there has been an intentional effort to really protect participants of clinical research. So back in 1974, a document called the Belmont Report was written, and it summarizes the basic ethical principles that were identified by the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects, Biomedical and Behavioral Research. So that's quite a mouthful. But basically, all of these principles that were outlined in the report have been codified into federal law to protect human participants of clinical research. And so you can see these three main principles on your screen. The main one is respect for persons. And this just requires that people are able to enter research voluntarily and with enough information. So you can't be forced to take part in research, and you have to be really told everything that's going to be happening to you, which we'll delve into a little bit deeper in future slides. Beneficence basically states that, I know in medicine, people have probably heard of first do no harm. Well, in research, they have an obligation to not only minimize possible harm, but also maximize possible benefit for patients. And so in the case of research, you're never able to just do something to a person just to see what will happen. You actually have to have that requirement of feeling as though, or based on previous research, having an indication that you actually can benefit somebody based on your research. And the third, and just as equally important, is justice. And so justice takes into consideration that classes of people such as economically disadvantaged people, racial and ethnic minorities, or persons who are confined to institutions are not being used in research out of convenience, rather than their connection to the problem that's actually being studied. So on the flip side of that, the principle of justice basically demands also that classes of people who have a connection to the disease are also not being excluded from being part of the research either. So that's these are the three kind of pillars of clinical research and the pillars of kind of protecting and trying to have an ethical framework for the industry. And so if you're thinking about taking part in a clinical trial, you will be asked to review a document that is called an informed consent. And so before you can even give your consent to participate in a trial, you must clearly understand the information about the trial, such as its purpose, its length, and the possible risks and benefits about participating, and what will happen to you before the trial. So this includes things like what you're going to be asked to do, when you'll be asked to do these things, and all of the tests and procedures that will be done, and also how your personal data will be used. And so, a lot of times, even for myself, going to the doctor, learning about all different treatment options can be confusing and quite overwhelming. So you might be wondering, well, what happens if you don't understand the information that they're telling you? Well, it is actually the responsibility of the research team to share all of the information about the trial with you, and also to give you all of the time that you need to review and understand that information and answer all your questions, even if that means that you have to set up another appointment or come back later to give you enough time to process all of that information. So if you have someone who legally makes your health decisions for you, they can also provide consent on your behalf. But this usually only happens, so if you're too young, so in the case of minors, if you're too sick, or for some other reason, can't fully comprehend the information of the trial. And so it's extremely important to note, just to revisit again, that even after you give consent to a trial, you can choose to stop participating at any time and for any reason. Your participation is voluntary. And so the staff at the trial will help you to do this safely if for some reason you decide that after starting the trial, you don't want to continue anymore.
All right, great. Thank you. Let's go into a little bit more detail, if that's okay, Bridget. What are all the things that a person should be thinking about and asking about before they sign their name on that informed consent form?
Yeah, well, there are so many things. And like I mentioned before, you want to make sure that, your decision to participate in research is one that is made in consideration with your healthcare team and also with, people that you trust in your life. It's very important to discuss and to be aware of not only the potential benefits, but also the potential risks before you join a clinical trial. But making an informed decision actually goes past that as well, because there are so many other topics that you should proactively discuss with your healthcare team. So for example, you want to make sure that you understand what is the main purpose of the trial. So, what are they doing the study for? You want to find out if you're going to receive investigational treatment or placebo. And so while it may not be possible for your research investigator or your research doctor to tell you which arm you're going to be on, you at least want to know, is there a possibility that I might receive a placebo instead of the actual treatment? And then you also want to know how the treatment will be given to you. If you have a fear of needles and this is going to be an injection, if you have trouble swallowing or issues with that, you want to know you're going to have to swallow a lot of pills on this study. These are the kind of things that you want to find out in order to determine whether this is going to be the right trial for you. And then you also want to find out how long you're going to be able to receive the study treatment. And so kind of tying in with that, you also want to find out how long will the trial last. And so this is not only, is it going to be 6 months? Is it going to be a year? Is it going to be 2 years? But also how long will your study visits take? If you have a full-time job, are you going to have to miss a day of work? And if so, how often will that be? And most research studies that require you to come into the office, to the clinic rather, are done Monday through Friday, during business hours. So that could be a determining factor for you. You also want to find out, if you're going to have to pay anything in order to be a part of the research study. And if you're having to, travel, out of town, maybe to go to your research appointments, or, if you're there all day, are they going to compensate you for lunch? These are all the kind of things that you would want to find out. And then also, you'd also want to know if you're still going to be able to see your own doctor. And if so, is that information from the research study going to be shared with them, and how? And so it's also important to ask certain questions about the full experience of the trial. So, a very big thing to ask is, what's known about the safety and how well this therapy works? That's something that is very important, and it's really kind of central to the whole point of doing the trial in the first place. So you want to make sure that that's, that whatever the risk profile or whatever the efficacy profile of the medication is something that you're willing to take on. You want to find out if you're going to have to stop your current treatment. If your beta blockers, are working well for you, or you're going to have to come off those in order to be a part of a research study. And then also you want to find out what tests and treatments you're going to have to undergo. A lot of these tests could involve things like blood work, maybe having x-rays or CT scans. And you just want to kind of find out, what all is going to be involved before you sign up to take part in a study. And then you also want to find out, kind of as the trial is coming to an end, what happens if you decide to stop participating at any point in the trial? Will you be able to return to your current treatment, or is that treatment no longer going to be appropriate once you've been a part of this trial? And then also something that a lot of people wonder about is if the study drug seems to work better than your prior treatments, will you be able to continue using it after the study ends, or will that not be an option? And then also you want to find out what kind of follow-up care is going to be provided to you after the clinical trial. Does it stop immediately, or does it go on for several months or years? And if so, is that something that you're going to be willing to take part in after the trial is over?
All right, thank you. You bring up so many important points, and I know that every trial is different, but I was hoping you could help us understand a few of the considerations that you just raised. So if we could kind of do a little rapid fire session.
Sure.
So first of all, what if I get in the placebo arm of a clinical trial and I don't get any treatment?
Yeah, and so this is one of, I think, the most common questions, and one of the most common things that people think about when they think about research. So, if you agree to participate in a clinical trial, you might receive the trial treatment, so the drug being studied, or you could receive, the placebo, which is given to you just like the treatment, but it doesn't have any actual medication in it. And then there's also a third option that people don't necessarily always think about, which is you just might get the treatment that is already approved for public use for your condition. So you don't get to necessarily choose if you get the investigational treatment or a placebo. And also, you may not even know which one you received until the end of the trial, because they take pains to really kind of make sure that, whether it's the placebo or the investigational treatment, that they look identical, that they're administered in an identical way. So, it may not be till the end of the trial that you actually even receive, that you actually even you actually even know which one you received. But if you have a condition that needs treatment, it's very important to point out that you will not just be given a sugar pill. You will most likely be given the standard medical treatment in addition to the placebo. So, all clinical trials are reviewed by and approved by an institutional review board, which is basically an ethical board that makes sure that research participants are protected. And an IRB would never approve a clinical trial that says that participants that need treatment will only receive a placebo when there's a standard medical treatment available.
Okay, thank you. And then I know this will be of interest particularly to our community members that have either hypothyroidism or hyperthyroidism, or especially thyroid eye disease. What if my condition starts to deteriorate while I'm in the middle of this trial?
Yeah, that's another good question. Like we mentioned, participation is strictly voluntary. But the good thing about being in a clinical trial is that your health is being so closely monitored. So if there is a change in your medical condition while you're on a trial, the trial staff will discuss that with you. And that, y'all may come to the decision that you need to leave the clinical trial in order to receive a treatment that's more effective. And that's perfectly okay, but they will help you to safely kind of transition from the study treatment if that's necessary, so that you can go and seek a different treatment elsewhere.
Thank you. And then kind of on the flip side, if you're somebody that is doing great and the trial ends, will you still have access to that treatment if you did get the investigational medication?
Yeah, and that's another good question, and really one that there are several considerations that go into it. Before the clinical trial, it's really important to have these conversations with your PI or the research doctor and the site staff to find out how your medical care will be transitioned as the trial ends. You also want to find out who will be your primary doctor moving forward after the trial. And if, like you said, you will have that access to the study medication afterwards. Will your medical records be accessible afterwards? And then also if you're going to even be informed of the outcome of the clinical trial afterwards. But so in order to answer your question, sponsors don't necessarily have obligation to continue to providing access to a treatment after a trial ends. But when you're having that conversation during informed consent, all of this should be outlined. So you'll know ahead of time, whether or not that is an option or not. The good news is that, in some cases in phase 2 or phase 3 studies, they have something called an extension. And what that basically means is that if the researchers are seeing or are believing that people are actually really benefiting from an investigational medication, instead of just ending the trial at the normal time that they had planned to, they may actually extend it for a longer period of time. And that just gives researchers opportunity to study kind of a more longer term use of the medication, and also gather additional information about the safety and the efficacy of that potential medication. So in that case, you may, of course, they would come to you and they would let you know about that, but you would have the opportunity to actually use the study medication for a little bit longer, especially if it's actually providing some benefit. So as I mentioned before, biopharmaceutical and companies and drug sponsors are not obligated to provide the study drug after the trial is over, but they may actually have programs that can assist you with the cost of the drug after the clinical trial ends. But that is more in cases of where a drug has already been approved for public use. If it's an investigational product that hasn't been approved by FDA, there are certain mechanisms where the pharmaceutical company may be able to intervene and help you to have access to that drug, especially in case of rare or fatal diseases. There are some mechanisms where that drug could be made available. But there's also the possibility of, just moving on to another clinical trial and trying out a different drug or treatment that could work for you.
All right, thank you. Now I have 2 more questions for you, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. So just a reminder that you can type your question in the Q&A feature on Zoom. So this is obviously a big one. How much will it cost me to participate? And will my insurance cover the costs?
Right. And so usually most of the costs of a trial are covered by the trial sponsor. So every trial in the informed consent has a section that explains possible costs and payments that you may have to pay and the expenses that will be covered. So certain things like travel costs, taxis, gas, hotels, and whatnot could be costs that are covered by the trial. But then there are some other costs of the trial that might be covered by your health insurance. So if you're having blood work or things like that you would normally have in the regular course of your treatment. But if there are costs that insurance might not cover, the informed consent will kind of break that down for you. So it's really important to kind of look at that and really familiarize yourself with that and ask questions. One thing I did want to point out is you don't need to have health insurance to participate in clinical research. But if you don't have health insurance, you just may need to speak with your trial staff about payment options for any of the things that are not covered by the sponsor and by the research trial itself. So some trial sponsors do have programs in place to pay for care that would normally be covered by insurance. But if you have insurance, then your coverage works the same as it does for your usual health care. So there could be copays, there could be deductibles that you're required to pay. And I also wanted to point out that insurance plans will only cover care as part of research trials that have been approved by an IRB, so by those ethical review boards. It's important to know that most health insurers can't refuse to let you join a clinical trial, and they also can't limit your benefits because you decide to be in a clinical trial. But it is important, before you join a trial, you just want to give your health insurance a call and find out, what costs that they will cover. So you can just kind of give them the study information and information from your research healthcare team to kind of, figure that out ahead of time. And so if your insurance plan doesn't cover out-of-network coverage, then the trial care must be covered, must be in network to be covered. Okay, so you just want to make sure that, like I said, you tell your insurance provider the name of the trial site and find out if it's in your network, and then, kind of go through all those details with them. And so sometimes if it's a life-threatening condition, then insurance companies will cover it. So, I know that all of this can seem kind of a little bit, conditional, but like I said, it really is important to just have those open lines of communication, not only with your research study team, but also with your health insurance ahead of time, just to kind of find out in case, some of this can be covered on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And last question for you, and then we'll open it up for some more Q&A. Where should we go to learn about clinical trial opportunities?
Yeah, so there are luckily many, many resources to help keep people informed about research opportunities. The first stop is it's always helpful just to speak with your doctor to find out about different treatment options for your medical condition. Doctors who participate in clinical trials are really good about giving access to their patients about different off-label uses for medications or about different treatment options. So I would suggest, starting by talking to your healthcare provider. If they feel comfortable, they can kind of refer you on to find out more about research trials. Also, another really good one is volunteer health organizations. They provide very specialized aid and services to people with a particular disease condition. And so that also includes things like clinical trial opportunities. So if you go to, for example, GDATF.org's resource page, you can find out a little more about clinical trials there. And a lot of these organizations usually have national or local chapters and even maybe support groups that you can, kind of connect with and find out more about research. There's also registries and research networks. And a registry is basically focused on a particular disease condition, procedure, or medical advice. And it's just an organized system that you can sign up for, and that it's more kind of in the observational category, where you're just kind of, updating as you go along, and it's collecting information just to kind of see the outcome of your disease condition over, a large amount of people over time. And another really helpful resource is clinicaltrials.gov. It is a government website, but in recent months, they've actually been making a lot of changes to the website to make it a little bit more user-friendly, so the general public can go in there and you can kind of search by disease type, you can search by location, you can really just find out about all of the clinical trials that are going on in the United States. They're required to be listed on that website, and you can find out if they have openings or ones that are coming down the line. And so it's a really good resource that anybody can actually just go to and search in for yourself. And there's contact information listed there for the research staff so that you can actually find out directly from them about what's required to be a part of a study.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we have some time for a few additional questions. Just a reminder, you can type your question in the Q&A portion of Zoom. So first of all, and you touched on, being able to recruit from urban versus rural areas. And I did want to touch on the rural areas, particularly with thyroid eye disease. Our community members may not be driving. They could have severe double vision. And so it might be, out of the question for them to drive, 4 hours to the nearest major metropolitan area. Is there any hope for folks that are in these rural areas? Are there things that the sponsors can do to help kind of balance that out?
Yeah, and that's important because they're actually, especially during the pandemic, but even before so, there was kind of like a really big push kind of out of necessity to kind of do these more what are called decentralized clinical trials. So typically clinical trials have been run out of kind of large academic medical centers. So think of your big cities, your big city hospitals. Um, there has been more of a push to actually kind of run clinical trials through community-based physicians' offices. But even like you're saying, if people have thyroid eye disease, even that's not, going to solve the problem. But with decentralized clinical trials, the model is altered to where actually like healthcare providers, like nurses, medical assistants, actually come to a participant's house and actually administer the care right there. So there has definitely been a huge push for that model. Like I said, it was made necessary during the pandemic, but it's still ongoing, and it's just one of the ways that the industry has had to really kind of innovate and continue to grow to really kind of meet the needs of people, to ensure that more and more people can participate in research.
Okay, that's really good to hear. And you also mentioned missing work, and so I wonder if that might help, relieve some of the burden from that as well. Because a lot of people in our community don't discuss with their employer or their colleagues that they have this diagnosis. If it's severe thyroid eye disease, it may be visible, but for Graves' disease or for Hashimoto's thyroiditis, they might not want to talk to their boss about their diagnosis. So that would be great if you could decentralize it and give people a better, more convenient opportunity to participate. And then, so you talked about study arms, and some are getting the investigational drug, some the placebo. Can the researchers ensure that the arms are balanced? Since we talk about, well, randomized double-blind controlled trials are the gold standard. What if you do end up with one arm that's all women and one arm that's all men, or they're not evenly divided by race and ethnicity and age? You mentioned age. Is there anything that can be done to balance that out, or is it just kind of luck of the draw for each trial?
Yeah, well, so it kind of is luck of the draw, but when we're talking about randomized, there are kind of like very sophisticated, computer algorithms and all these sorts of things that really take that population and truly randomize it. So if it's truly randomized, that means that your assignment to arm A or arm B is truly by chance, like the flip of a coin. So there's, if there's two arms, there's a 50-50 chance you could end up in either one. So it probably would be highly unlikely that you would have, one group of, people with all similar traits that would end up in one arm or the other. It really would truly be a randomized set of people. So does that answer your question?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And like you said, a little bit luck in the draw too. For example, there was a study several years ago on a thyroid eye disease drug, and one of the things that was pointed out was, well, there were more smokers in one arm than in the other arm, and with thyroid eye disease, smokers are known to they don't respond as well to available treatment. So.
And that's good that you point that out. And so the reason that they were able to figure that out is because, even though the study is blinded, that basically just means that neither the sponsor nor the investigator, so the research doctor or the participant might know what they're receiving. However, let's say, for example, we're looking at all of the results kind of in a big picture way. So not with, anybody's name attached to it, but just looking at all of the data. If we're seeing, hey, it looks like all of these people did really poorly on the drug, like what's up with that? There is an option for the study to then become unblinded. So again, not looking at, whose name, who took part in the study, but just, hey, what are some of the characteristics of these people that are in common? So as you know, every time you go to the doctor, they ask you things about your personal medical history, you're a smoker, are you, how many times you exercise, family history. All of that data, is also recorded as part of research studies. And so that's the kind of data that might, cause people, hey, you know what, let's take a second look and let's see what's going on with these people. And then in that way, researchers are able to kind of look at trends across the participants that they might be like, hey, you know what, this medication, maybe, when it comes out, a lot of times, you'll hear on the commercials and they'll kind of give that whole kind of like fast forward part at the end, do not use if you're a smoker, if you're this, and that's where all of that comes from. Because, there are mechanisms in place where we're looking at the analysis of the data, we can actually tell, hey, there's something going on in this subset of people. What is that commonality? So yeah, so if by chance, the randomization kind of doesn't account for that, then, that's the way that all of those things will be discovered and accounted for at the end.
Okay.
Really good question.
Thank you. So you talked about observational versus investigational studies, and I was really interested in that because I listened in on the U.S. Senate Health Committee had a hearing on long COVID recently, and there was actually a very big discussion about observational versus investigational studies because there are 0 treatments available right now, and there's all of these people who are desperate for treatment and they need it yesterday, but there's obviously a lengthy process to go through all of the steps of a clinical trial. And I wondered if you could just talk about the timing of the observational versus the investigational studies and how quickly you might get useful information out of each of those types.
Well, yeah, so I guess by design, observational studies really, could be just kind of as long as the subset of, people who are taking part in that study, are alive. And so I think the really key part there is that you can find out, especially even with the case of medications, if we give it to somebody, and, 6 months from now, they're feeling better, but then a year from now, we're seeing kind of diminished, effects of the diminished benefits of the drug. So, by design, observational studies are meant to go on for very long periods of time. That's not to say that, researchers may not be able to kind of make, certain assumptions or make certain discoveries throughout that time frame. But really, the gold standard, like you mentioned, is a controlled interventional study. But even then, especially for a new disease like COVID, regardless of whether you're in the observational or the interventional, it's a new disease. So we're still actually, I think you could say that they're all kind of still in the observational phase. But, for, diseases that have, been established, that where they have had the time, the historical, data to actually look and see, the progress of people with a disease or a condition. I think that there is an advantage, to having the interventional studies, data from interventional studies, but, I think, they both kind of serve different purposes, I guess is kind of the best answer that I could give. But in a case like COVID, there's a lot more of that phase 4 data that's going to be so key because we're actually getting to see kind of how all the treatments that were approved in the last few years, we're still kind of gathering data about them and seeing how, people are progressing, if they have reinfections, how does that impact them? And with it being such a new disease, all of that information is really vital and not necessarily one better than the other.
Okay, thank you. And I'm sure that like completely threw a loop in a lot of studies that were already ongoing with people that may have, been infected and reinfected, and how do you know what was COVID and what might have been the investigational drug? I'm sure that was has been and continues to be a challenge.
Yeah, but it's so important because I think in the case of like a study where you've kind of have a lot more control over the the people that are able to be in the study and the people who you're treating, it's just such a controlled environment. It's really not realistic to what the millions of people, kind of in the general population are going to be doing with this drug. And so, it really does become very interesting and very vital that phase 4 data is still being collected And that's, on any medication that gets approved, not just on COVID medications. It's so important to continue that phase 4 piece so that you can see, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the line, are we seeing any kind of weird things popping up that we didn't anticipate?
Okay, thank you. And to kind of circle back to where you talked about how the study population ideally would look like the patient population, and that might not always be the case, in terms of age, gender, race, ethnicity. Is there anything that sponsors should be doing more of to try to make sure that that these study populations actually look like the patient community? Is there anything that groups like our foundation should be doing to make sure we're getting better participation?
There is a really big effort by FDA that's underway right now to really kind of actually start to put into practice guidelines that sponsors actually have to follow. In the past, they've put out kind of recommendations and, just kind of information, but actually there are now regulations in place that require that for phase 2 studies and above, that you actually sponsors have to come up with what's called a diversity action plan. And this actually kind of goes into really delving into who are the populations that are impacted by the disease. What is the proportion of those communities? And then really requiring sponsors to come up with a goal. I'm going to include, 10% of, the 100 people that I want to be in this study have to be people of color or have to be women, or, that is actually a regulation that FDA has put in place in the last few years. And there have been cases where sponsors who have not met that goal, or study teams that have not met that goal at the end of the study, have had to actually go back and, recruit additional participants so that they could meet that goal. And so, of course, that is, a huge blow to a sponsor, financially, and then also in terms of time. So, it's really kind of come as a really kind of like notice, put sponsors on notice that, you really need to take this seriously and really kind of plan for this in the initial stages of the study, because it really is that important to actually, include people so that we can actually get, at the end of all of this, get medications that can treat as many people, as possible from different communities who are impacted by these conditions.
All right, thank you. And as you say that, I'm thinking about the, what's come to light in recent years about the little finger pulse oximeters, and they're finding out that, oh, wow, they work differently on darker skin tones. Well, that would have been helpful to know, at the start of the COVID crisis, when people were relying on that to say, oh, do I need to go to the emergency room? So absolutely so critical to get that diverse participation.
Definitely. And then even with, just men and women, there are differences that we're seeing, in addition to being, primarily, I think, white people who are overrepresented in study populations. They also tend to be more men than, more than 50% of research participants are usually men. And so, there are definitely, physiological differences, that can kind of come out in interesting ways. And, we really want to try to find out about these things as early as possible, in the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 portions of the study, versus finding out about them, 10, 15 years later, or really just even when you make it available to the general public. The goal is to really kind of find out as soon as possible so that you can account for that and, really kind of come up with the best treatment possible as soon as possible.
Okay. So we have time for one more question. So you've talked a little bit about sponsors, and obviously this type of research is very expensive. Can you talk about the funding of clinical trials? Who's doing the funding? If it's a pharmaceutical company that's funding the research, are there firewalls in place to make sure that the marketing team isn't talking to the clinical team and that type of thing?
Yeah, so these are all really good questions. So basically the way that that's handled in research is by disclosing. So, just the presence of, a sponsor, maybe having an investigator on their board, or having an investigator, sponsoring their study and putting a lot of dollars into a particular site does not automatically mean that there's something inappropriate going on. But the way that the FDA handles this is by requiring all investigators and sponsors to actually fill out a whole lot of paperwork, just disclosing, the amounts of these funds and who they're coming from. And so once FDA has those on file, they are reviewed and they are able to, make sure that there's nothing untoward going on. So those are called financial disclosures. Everybody, all of the researchers and all the sponsors have to include those as part of their paperwork that they submit along with their clinical research plan. And those are reviewed, and those are also reviewed not only on a federal level, but also many institutions and hospitals also have their own policies at that institutional level, so that they're able to kind of have those checks and balances and have offices and staff that that's their primary role, is to kind of manage that process and make sure that there's nothing that could be a conflict of interest taking place.
All right, great. Thank you. And thank you so much to everybody that took time out of their day to join us today. I would especially like to thank Bridget for sharing her expertise with us today, and JB and everyone behind the scenes who you didn't see on screen today, for putting together this webinar and for keeping things running. I hope that today's talk has left you feeling empowered to seek out potential options for clinical trials, and then take that information and bring it to your care team, who can help you decide if there's a particular trial that's right for you. And with that, I'll turn it back over to JB to wrap up.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful discussion, Kimberly and Bridget. This was a wonderful program. If I could just have the next slide, please. So as a quick follow-up, you will get a resource with all of the information that you learned summarized today. This will come in a follow-up email, and you will also have on that source the GDATF contact information, so you can reach out to them. You can also learn about clinical trials in the Graves' disease and thyroid disease space that they have listed on their website, as well as get the links to clinicaltrials.gov, which is one of the resources that Bridget had raised earlier. So this will be coming to you in a thank you email. Also, as part of that thank you email, and I mentioned this earlier on, if we could just go to the last slide, you'll have a 5-question survey. So we are constantly trying to improve our programs. We are also trying to create programs that will be interesting to patient advocates. So please it'll take you 5 minutes to fill out our survey, so I have that information, and we can continue to develop important skill building programs that matter to you, and we can improve the programs that we have. So thank you so much for attending this AIM program, and I hope everybody has a wonderful evening.